There are bonds that stay warm in memory and still leave a question behind. You remember the ease first, a walk that kept going after the practical reason for it had ended, a voice that made a hard week lighter, a person whose company felt close enough that you stopped asking what held the bond together. Then, often much later, another thought appears. Not whether the whole thing was false, not whether one person secretly meant harm. The quieter question is harder than that. What exactly was being loved there? Was it the help, the delight, the long history, the person, or some mixture that only looked simple while life stayed favorable? Aristotle asks because friendship matters too much to leave in one blurred shape. He treats it as necessary to life, serious enough to deserve distinctions, and beautiful enough not to be reduced to suspicion. So tonight is not about exposing fraud everywhere. It is about asking a more exact question. If closeness can be real and still leave the basis of the bond unclear, what has to be true between two people for friendship to be real in the fullest sense? There is a harder and more useful way to hear that word, and it is worth staying with. By the end of tonight, I want to leave you with a harder and more useful way of hearing the word friendship, as something whose basis can be examined without cynicism and whose highest form asks more of us than warmth alone. If you enjoy thinking through questions like this with me, subscribing to the channel helps others find them too. Sharing the video helps even more. Let's begin. Two people can spend years in one another's company and still leave behind an uncertainty that has nothing to do with scandal. The late ache is often less dramatic than betrayal. Sometimes nobody lied, nobody announced a hidden agenda, nothing theatrical happened at all. One life bent in a different direction, or one need fell away, or one person's delight changed, and then the bond thinned. That thinning makes the mind ask a question it did not know how to ask while the friendship was active. Was the closeness enough to explain itself, or was something else carrying it all along? It is important to begin there because the usual language is already too crude. The ordinary temptation is to turn every unresolved friendship into a detective story. We ask who used whom, who failed whom, who was more sincere, who deserved the title. Aristotle is not beginning from that mood. In Book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics *, he starts from a larger claim. Friendship is not a sentimental accessory, it belongs to life itself. Human beings need it, cities need it, moral life is shaped by it. Once the subject is treated with that seriousness, a new obligation appears. We cannot leave friendship in a haze of nice feeling. That is why the opening doubt is not cynical. Cynicism says warmth was only disguise. Aristotle says something more disciplined. Warmth may be real and still not tell us enough. A bond can comfort you, steady you, delight you, and still leave the basis of the relation unclear. The question is not whether the warmth happened. The question is what, in that warmth, was being loved. Was it the help? Was it the pleasure? Was it the character of the other person? Was it some mixture that felt unified while life stayed favorable, then separated under pressure? That pressure matters because our language usually resists it. We say friend as if the word solved the problem in advance. Once the title is spoken, we often stop asking what the relation actually consists in. If someone was there during a difficult year, we feel ungrateful for asking more. If someone made a season lighter, we feel severe for asking more. If someone knew us for a long time, we feel almost disloyal for asking more. Aristotle's argument begins by freeing us from that hesitation. Exactness is not betrayal. A bond can deserve gratitude without already being the highest form of friendship. Think about how often memory keeps two truths together. You can remember a bond with tenderness and still know it did not survive the disappearance of a shared project. You can remember how alive you felt with someone and still know the relation faded once the shared delight changed. You can remember loyalty and still feel that each of you had been inhabiting the bond under a different understanding. These are not trivial disappointments, they are clues. They suggest that one word has been carrying several different relations at once. Aristotle's seriousness about friendship comes from this exact place. If friendship were merely a mood, then classification would feel bloodless. But because friendship reaches into how a life is lived, its differences matter morally. To know what sort of friendship a bond was is not to reduce it. It is to respect it enough to ask what sustained it and what it could reasonably bear. Some friendships can bear change well, some cannot. Some are built for a season, some depend on a more durable basis. Treating them all as one thing does not honor them. It confuses them. This also means the coming distinctions are not a purity test. Aristotle is not about to tell us that ordinary companionship never counted. He does not say every bond that ends was counterfeit. He does not teach that only a rare and exalted relation deserves gratitude while everything else is mere exchange in disguise. The harder claim is subtler. Different kinds of friendship are genuine in different ways, and the basis of the bond determines both its beauty and its fragility. That thought already changes the pressure. The ache left behind by a fading bond is no longer forced into one dramatic question: was it real or not? Aristotle gives us a better question: what kind of reality did it have? That is a calmer question, but not a smaller one. It lets us keep tenderness without sentimentality. It lets us keep disappointment without turning every ending into treachery, and it prepares the mind for a possibility our ordinary speech hides from us. Friendship may be said in more than one way. Once that possibility appears, the title of friend starts to sound less like a verdict and more like an inquiry. Not because the word becomes empty, but because it becomes richer. It asks about the object of love, the shape of reciprocity, the stability of character, and the life two people actually share. We have not answered any of those questions yet. We have only stopped pretending the feeling of closeness answers them in advance. There is another reason this first correction matters. Without it, we keep blaming people for what may have been built into the bond from the beginning. If the friendship was carried by a season of shared work, then the end of that work may feel like a personal rejection when it is really the removal of the relation's main support. If the friendship was carried by delight, then the dimming of delight may feel like betrayal when it is partly the loss of what first joined two lives. Aristotle does not remove pain from any of this. He does something better. He changes the shape of the pain. Instead of treating every thinning bond as evidence of bad character, he asks us to look at the bond's basis. That makes mourning less theatrical and more truthful. Sometimes what hurts is not treachery. It is discovering that a friendship we experienced under one name was being sustained by something narrower than we knew. This early exactness also protects gratitude. When people realize a bond was conditional, they often react in one of two exaggerated ways. Either they insist the friendship must still have been perfect because admitting any limit feels disloyal, or they strip the whole memory of dignity because the relation did not last in the highest form. Aristotle gives us a middle path. A friendship can have been real enough to deserve thanks and still limited enough to disappoint the hopes we later placed in it. That is why his distinctions are humane instead of cold. He is not taking affection away from us. He is asking us to stop asking affection to settle every question by itself. Under that light, the uncertainty left by an old friendship becomes less like accusation and more like unfinished understanding. That unfinished understanding changes how we listen to our own memory. A bond that once felt simple begins to separate into its elements. There was loyalty, yes, but perhaps the loyalty was tied to one shared burden. There was warmth, yes, but perhaps the warmth lived inside a delight that could not stay constant. There was gratitude, perhaps even love, and yet the basis remained thinner than the name friendship made it sound. Aristotle does not ask us to harden our hearts against any of that. He asks for clearer hearing. Once we stop demanding that one word explain every form of closeness, we can honor the relation that existed without pretending it had to answer every hope we later placed upon it. That is enough for a beginning. The doubt is not cynical, it is more exact, and if friendship is more than one thing, the next step is to name the kinds. Aristotle's first great move is disarmingly simple. He asks what people love in one another. not how intense the bond feels, not how dramatic its history is, not how often the word friend is used. He asks what the bond is actually organized around. In books 8 and 9, 3 answers appear with great clarity. Sometimes we love another person because they are useful to us, sometimes because they are pleasant to us, sometimes because they are good, and we love them for their own sake as good. These are not 3 temperatures of one thing. They are 3 different bases of friendship. That distinction matters because we usually imagine friendship as one scale. We picture a weak friendship, a medium friendship, a strong friendship. More time means more depth. More affection means more truth. More shared experience means more reality. Aristotle interrupts that whole picture. He does not deny that bonds can be more or less intense. He says intensity is not the first question. The first question is the object of love. What is it in the other person that makes this relation hang together? Utility friendship is easy to misunderstand because the word use now sounds harsh. We hear exploitation before anything else. Aristotle means something broader and more ordinary. Human beings help one another constantly. They collaborate, support, teach, protect, advise, accompany, exchange, and depend. A relation can be genuine while being organized around some need, some service, some benefit. The other person is valued through the good they bring into one's life. That does not make the bond unreal. It tells us what kind of bond it is. Pleasure friendship is equally easy to oversimplify. We imagine frivolity or shallowness, but Aristotle has something wider in view. The pleasant can include wit, delight, admiration, ease, companionship in activity, mutual animation, the quickening of life in another's presence. Some people seem to make the world lighter, some make conversation alive, some bring joy to a shared practice or way of spending time. Bonds built on delight are real too. Again, the question is not whether the feeling happens, the question is what sustains the relation once delight changes. Then there is the friendship of the good, often called virtue friendship. Here the other is loved for who they are in their character, and one wishes the good for them for their own sake. Already the shape is different. The benefit one receives matters, the pleasure matters, but neither is the governing basis. The relation is grounded in a shared orientation toward the good. That makes it rarer and more stable, but we should not rush there too quickly. If we treat it like the only friendship that counts, we will distort Aristotle before we have even understood him. Because everyday life is mixed, many real friendships contain all 3 elements. A close friend may delight you, help you, and also be someone you admire as good. Aristotle knows that human bonds are not laboratory specimens. Still, the distinction remains necessary because one basis usually governs the relation when life becomes difficult. When circumstances change, what disappears first? When strain arrives, what does each person feel most deprived of? The answer often reveals what the friendship had been resting on all along. This is why the 3-fold account is not an internet sorting game. Aristotle is not encouraging us to label people and rank our contacts. He is trying to make us hear one word more carefully. Friendship covers several relations that resemble one another in warmth and goodwill, while differing in object, stability, and expectation. Without that distinction, we misunderstand both the beauty of ordinary companionship and the difficulty of the highest form. Imagine 2 bonds that feel equally dear in the moment. In one, you and the other person are bound by a shared labor that matters to both of you. In the other, you are drawn together by delight in each other's presence, by an ease of spirit that neither of you can summon with many others. Both are genuine. Both may involve care. Both may involve loyalty. But they are not governed by the same principle. If the labor ends, one bond is pressured at its root. If the delight fades, the other is pressured at its root. To know that is not to cheapen the bonds. It is to hear the drama already inside them. Aristotle's categories therefore do more than classify. They interpret change. They explain why some endings feel like moral collapse, while others feel like a season naturally closing, though not without sadness. They explain why some people remain grateful for a friendship that did not last. They explain why one bond deepens when practical need falls away, while another quietly vanishes with no great betrayal at all. Different objects of love yield different forms of endurance. It also means that the same friendship can sound very different depending on when you describe it. During the living moment, a bond may feel simple because usefulness, delight, admiration and care are all present at once. Only later, often under strain, do the layers separate. The practical cooperation ends, and one discovers there is still a friendship there. Or the pleasure thins, and one discovers almost nothing remains. Or a bond that began in utility slowly acquires a different center because the people involved come to value each other beyond the original need. Aristotle's taxonomy is not only about labeling finished relations. It helps us hear movement. Friendships can remain in one mode. They can also mature, fail, or reveal themselves through change. That gives the account a dramatic shape the modern habit of quick labels usually misses. This is why Aristotle keeps asking what is loved, rather than what is claimed. Human beings can say friend with perfect sincerity and still be wrong about the relation's basis. We call someone a friend because we trust the warmth, or because our lives are interwoven, or because we cannot imagine speaking of them otherwise. Yet if the object of love is still largely benefit or delight, then the bond will respond to pressure differently from a friendship centered on character. The categories therefore save us from a false comfort. It is comforting to think one strong word can cover every good relation. Aristotle thinks that comfort comes at the price of confusion. Better to have a richer and more demanding language than a flatter one that leaves us bewildered the moment life changes the terms. A useful question begins to emerge here. If this friendship lost one of its goods, which loss would wound it at the center? If the answer is practical help, we are close to utility. If the answer is delight in company, we are close to pleasure. If the answer is the disappearance of the friend's stable goodness itself, we are nearing the highest form. Real friendships often contain all three goods, but the governing one reveals itself when life removes the others. Aristotle's taxonomy matters because it gives language to that test without turning the test into a cold exam. It simply asks what the bond cannot survive losing. So the word friendship has been doing too much work. Aristotle relieves it of that burden by separating the bases that ordinary speech keeps fused. The next task is not to race toward the highest kind as if the lower kinds were embarrassing. The next task is to let utility and pleasure be fully real, then hear their limits without contempt. Many people now hear practical benefit as contamination. The moment usefulness enters a relation, suspicion follows close behind. We imagine calculation, opportunism, cold exchange. Aristotle's treatment is much calmer than that. Utility is not an accidental corruption introduced into friendship from outside. Human life itself is full of need, cooperation and dependence. We help one another through tasks, dangers, obligations, learning, work, hardship and transitions. A bond organized around such help can be a true friendship in the sense that real goodwill exists there. Its limitation is not that it is false. Its limitation is that what is loved is tied to a benefit. That matters because it restores moral dignity to an enormous part of ordinary life. Think of people who come close through a season of difficulty, through a joint undertaking, through mutual support in some constrained part of the world. Their bond may carry genuine warmth. They may admire one another. They may be grateful. The friendship can matter deeply. But if the practical basis is the main thing holding the relation together, Aristotle says it is still friendship by utility. What disappears when the use disappears is not proof that the earlier bond was a lie. It shows what kind of bond it had been. Aristotle's language is sharp here. In such friendships, the person is loved incidentally through the advantage they bring. That phrase can sound harsher in modern ears than he intends. Incidental does not mean negligible. It means that the good one seeks is not primarily the other's character for its own sake, but the benefit attached to the relation. A business partner may be cherished, a guide may be trusted, a companion in hardship may be dear. Yet if the bond depends on the continuation of a shared benefit, then the benefit remains structurally central. This makes many ordinary experiences more legible. Two people can become close because each steadies the other's work. A student and mentor can grow fond while the relation is still organized around learning. Neighbors can help one another through a season of care, danger, or constraint. Companions in a long practical task can form a loyal bond while the task lasts. When the occasion falls away, the affection may remain, but the friendship no longer knows how to live in the same form. Aristotle does not say anyone has been exposed. He says the basis has reached its natural limit. That is a painful but cleaner way to understand certain endings. Sometimes we keep trying to extract a moral drama from what was really a structural change. We ask why they stopped calling, why the old rhythm disappeared, why the bond did not carry itself forward once the shared need was gone. Aristotle lets us say, because the shared need was not a side detail. It was one of the things being loved through the relation. When it vanished, the form of the friendship lost its center. None of this requires contempt. In fact, contempt would miss Aristotle's point. Utility friendships are necessary because life is full of mutual aid. A human being who refused such bonds would not be more pure. He would be refusing part of the social fabric in which ordinary goodness is lived. The problem begins only when we ask a utility friendship to bear what belongs to another kind of friendship. Then disappointment enters. We expected the bond to remain once the practical benefit had no governing force. Sometimes it does deepen into something else, often it does not. This is also why the modern word networking is too cheap for Aristotle's account. It reduces utility to a consciously instrumental posture, often strategic and thin. Aristotle is describing a much wider human terrain, including relations of real kindness and honor. A person can sincerely care for another while still loving them, mainly through the good they provide. That may be limited, but it is not necessarily cynical. The sincerity of care and the conditional basis of the bond can coexist. What utility friendship cannot do by itself is make the other's good central for the other's sake. If the friend is loved mainly as bearer of a benefit, then the benefit remains the hidden ruler of the relation. The person matters, but in a way tethered to what passes through them toward us. Aristotle's distinction becomes clearest when the advantage ends. If the bond dissolves with little left to sustain it, then we learn what had really been carrying the love. We can hear this more gently if we notice how much of human decency grows in such friendships. A person who helped you through confusing work, who showed up reliably in a difficult season, who made an unfamiliar place livable, may have been a real friend of utility in Aristotle's sense, and still a moral gift in your life. The fact that the relation later faded does not cancel the goodness that took place there. Utility friendships often teach steadiness, gratitude, and practical care. They show that friendship is not reserved for rarefied souls discussing the good under perfect conditions. It already exists in the daily traffic of mutual help. Aristotle lowers the temperature around usefulness by placing it inside ordinary human life, instead of outside moral seriousness. At the same time, utility makes some heartbreaks newly intelligible. Consider how confusing it feels when two people remain fond of one another, yet neither knows how to continue once the original structure is gone. They do not become enemies, they do not even necessarily become strangers. They simply lose the practice that kept their relation active. One no longer needs guidance, the work no longer joins them. The shared problem has been solved or abandoned. Nothing scandalous occurs, yet the friendship becomes thin. Aristotle's account lets us say that the bond was genuine while its center was elsewhere than we thought. That saves us from two bad readings at once. The paranoid reading that one person was secretly using the other all along, and the sentimental reading that if affection existed, the friendship should have survived unchanged. It is also possible, of course, for a friendship of utility to deepen. Aristotle never says practical bonds are trapped forever at their first level. Two people may begin by needing one another and end by valuing one another beyond the original need. That possibility matters because it keeps the account from becoming fatalistic. Utility is a basis, not a prison. Still, the transition must be earned. Once the practical occasion is gone, Something more has to remain active than gratitude for what was once exchanged. If it does, the friendship may be changing its kind. If it does not, then the bond was not betrayed by reality, it was disclosed by it. There is something merciful in that thought. It means not every fading friendship should be read as moral treachery. Sometimes the structure was temporary from the beginning. The friendship was real, its basis was limited. That is not an insult to what it gave. It is a refusal to ask one kind of bond to bear the burden of another. And once we see that, another form of closeness comes into view. Some friendships do not revolve around practical need at all. They revolve around delight. Those bonds can feel even more convincing, which is why Aristotle has to say something just as difficult about pleasure. There are people whose presence changes the air around a day. Conversation loosens with them. Silence is easy with them. A shared activity comes alive because they are there. Time feels lighter, more vivid, less defended. If utility friendships can be mistaken for strategic arrangements, pleasure friendships are often mistaken in the opposite direction. They seem self-authenticating. Surely joy proves depth. Surely delight is what closeness was for all along. Aristotle does not deny the reality of such bonds. He only asks whether delight alone can make them stable. His answer is careful. Pleasure friendships are genuine. They are not morally suspect simply because enjoyment is involved. In fact, some of the warmest and most memorable bonds in life are organized by shared delight. Youthful friendships often have this character for Aristotle, not because youth is frivolous, but because the pleasant changes quickly in a young life. Interests move, temperaments ripen, desires alter, forms of play or admiration shift, and the friendship moves with them or dissolves with them. Instability here is not accusation, it is description. This matters because modern seriousness often mistrusts joy. We can almost hear a quiet puritanism whenever a philosopher distinguishes pleasure from the good. Aristotle is not condemning happiness in company. He is not saying that delight cheapens relation. He is saying that if delight is the main thing loved, then the bond remains vulnerable to the changing of delight. The friend may be cherished intensely, yet cherished partly as the source of a way of feeling. When the feeling changes, the relation is pressured at its root. That helps explain a form of grief many people know well. A friendship may not end because anyone has become cruel or dishonorable. It may simply lose its animating pleasure. The wit that once ran freely does not. The shared pastime no longer joins two lives with the same force. A person who once drew out your liveliness no longer does so in the same way, or you no longer do so in theirs. If delight was central, the friendship may thin without deceit. The pain is real, but Aristotle would tell us not to misname it. This is one reason pleasure friendships can be so confusing. Their sincerity is obvious while they last. Often the enjoyment is mutual, open, abundant, and emotionally convincing. Nothing in the moment feels conditional because pleasure, unlike utility, does not announce its conditions as plainly. Need is easier to identify than delight. Benefit can be named. Joy is more elusive. It feels like the whole relation rather than one basis among others. That is why Aristotle's distinction can sound severe at first. He is not denying the joy. He is revealing its structural fragility. He also helps us avoid an ugly overcorrection. If pleasure can fade, the temptation is to dismiss pleasure friendships as shallow by definition. Aristotle does not do that. Some delight-based friendships are morally decent, loyal, and generous within their form. They may give a person years of warmth. They may shape memory with real tenderness. They may even train the soul toward better forms of companionship. Their limitation is not a lack of sincerity. Their limitation is that the loved object remains entwined with enjoyment. To see that distinction clearly, notice how different questions arise in pleasure and utility. In utility friendship, one asks what benefit is keeping the relation active. In pleasure friendship, one asks what delight is being sought in the other's company. The answers can be noble or ignoble, deep or shallow, but the structural point remains the same. The friend is not yet loved most fully as good in themselves. The bond is still governed by what the relation does for experience. That claim can feel almost offensive because delight often seems closer to the person than benefit does. To enjoy another's company feels more personal than receiving some practical good from them. Aristotle would agree that it is often more intimate. But intimacy is not yet the highest question. One can be intimately attached to another as a source of delight and still not yet love them in the fullest sense he is after. The pleasure reveals a connection. It does not settle the object of love once and for all. This is why pleasure friendships often leave behind a very peculiar sadness. When a useful relation ends, we can usually point to the cause. The project stopped, the need passed, the mutual advantage disappeared. In pleasure friendships, the cause is more elusive because what disappears is a way of being alive together. The old conversation loses lift. The old jokes no longer open the same room. The activity that once joined two people now leaves one of them cold. It can feel cruelly personal because delight seems so close to personality itself. Yet Aristotle would still tell us to distinguish between loving the person's good and loving the vividness one experiences with them. The second can be sincere without being sufficient. That is why the grief can be honest without proving the bond had no limit. Pleasure friendships also tempt us to exaggerate memory. Because they feel effortless while they last, we often imagine they were self-sustaining. Looking back, we say the friendship was real because nothing needed to be explained. The joy was its own proof. Aristotle interrupts that nostalgia. He asks what happened when delight and virtue pulled apart. Did truthfulness remain when amusement faded? Did concern for the other's good remain when the companionship ceased to flatter or energize the self in the same way? Those questions do not cheapen the happiness that occurred. They only prevent us from turning happiness into a final argument. Delight is one of the real goods friendship can contain. It is not the whole reason a friendship deserves its highest name. Pleasure can even hide instability precisely because it feels so natural. Two people may never ask what holds them together while the hours keep glowing. Then time shifts, interests divide, suffering enters, or one person changes in ways the shared delight cannot carry. The friendship seems to collapse out of nowhere, but Aristotle would say the collapse had a structure. What was loved most deeply was still the liveliness of the relation. That is why these friendships often feel both more intimate and more fragile than utility friendships. They reveal much of a person, yet they do not always reveal whether the person's good has become the center of concern. When delight changes, the bond may break with a sadness that remains honest. Sincerity can fade without having been fake. That line is important because it protects both gratitude and exactness. You need not mock the happiness you once found with someone in order to admit that the friendship was built around a pleasure neither of you could command forever. A relation can be beautiful and still incomplete. Utility and pleasure therefore share an important feature. Each is a genuine form of friendship. Each is also conditional on an object outside the stable goodness of the friend as friend. That is why Aristotle now turns toward the hardest possibility of all, what it would mean to love the other, not chiefly for use or delight, but as good. At the center of Aristotle's account stands a phrase that sounds simple until you try to live inside it. Friends of the highest kind wish the good for one another for the other's sake. Those final words do nearly all the work for the other's sake. They shift the object of love. Up to this point, we have seen bonds organized around what comes through the other toward us. Help, usefulness, pleasure, animation, delight. Now Aristotle asks whether the other person can become central as good in themselves. This does not mean becoming blind to everything one receives from the friendship. Aristotle is not asking for a pure altruism emptied of satisfaction. He is asking whether the governing basis of the bond is the character of the other and the good proper to their life. In such a friendship, pleasure and benefit remain present, often abundantly, but they follow from the relation instead of ruling it. One enjoys the friend, one is helped by the friend. Yet these are no longer the answer to the question of why this person is loved. That is why Aristotle's highest friendship is morally different before it is emotionally different. The feeling may be strong in many kinds of friendship. What changes here is the aim. To wish in others good for their own sake is to will that they flourish as the sort of person they are becoming, not merely that they continue supplying one with relief, admiration, support, amusement, or identity. It is possible to feel deeply attached to someone and still love mainly what happens to you around them. Aristotle's distinction exposes that possibility without cruelty. Notice how demanding this makes the question itself. Real friendship can no longer mean stronger affection plus loyalty. A person can be fiercely loyal to a shared pleasure. A person can be grateful and devoted within a relation of mutual use. Those are real forms of friendship, but the highest friendship asks a harder question. If the other ceased to delight me in the same way, or ceased to advantage me in the same way, would I still be oriented toward their good because of the sort of person they are? That is not easy to answer. It should not be. This is also where virtue friendship is often misunderstood. The word virtue can make the whole account sound pious, bloodless, or perfectionist. Aristotle does not mean that two flawless people form an immaculate bond. He means that goodness of character gives the relation its center. Each recognizes in the other a stable orientation toward what is noble and good, and that shared orientation makes it possible to care for the other's flourishing in a way not reducible to use or pleasure. The friendship becomes more weather-resistant because its basis is less accidental. Still, we should resist turning this into saintliness. Wishing the good for the other's sake is not moral theatre. It is not flattery dressed up as benevolence. It is not people-pleasing. It is not unconditional affirmation of whatever the other wants. Aristotle is not teaching that friendship means approving every desire in the friend. If anything, the higher standard allows correction, seriousness, and truthfulness, precisely because the other's good is at stake, not merely the continuation of a pleasant atmosphere. There is a quiet severity in that. To love another as good is to refuse to reduce them to how they make one's own life feel. It means the friend cannot simply be a mirror in which one enjoys oneself, or a witness who confirms one's story, or a comfort one clings to because their presence stabilizes the self. All of those things may happen inside friendship. Aristotle's point is that none of them by themselves establish the highest form. The other must become more than a source. They must be a good loved in themselves. That helps explain why virtue friendship feels beautiful and difficult at once. Most of us can imagine moments of it, perhaps not a whole life sustained at that altitude, but glimpses of a bond where admiration, goodwill, truthfulness, and shared direction matter more than convenience or thrill. Yet the standard also exposes how easily love bends back towards self-reference. We want to be seen, soothed, confirmed, accompanied. Aristotle does not deny those desires. He asks whether they rule the friendship or accompany something higher. Another way to hear this is to ask what kind of disappointment a friendship can survive. If the relation is centered on use, then the loss of benefit threatens the bond directly. If it is centered on pleasure, then the loss of delight threatens it directly. But if the relation is centered on the good of the other as other, then many disappointments no longer strike the center at all. The friend can be tired, inconvenient, less entertaining, less useful to your plans, and still remain lovable in the relevant sense. That does not mean the friendship becomes easy. In some ways it becomes harder, because the bond now asks for patience, truth, and moral seriousness. Yet that very seriousness is why the relation is less vulnerable to the ordinary weather of life. This is also why Aristotle's phrase about wishing the good must be heard actively. He is not describing a gentle mood that hovers above the relation like warm approval. He means that the other's flourishing becomes part of what one is for. Sometimes that will look tender, sometimes it will look exacting. A friend of the highest kind is not simply the person who keeps us comfortable. Sometimes they preserve truth where comfort would be easier. Sometimes they refuse to help us become smaller than we are capable of being. The friendship remains pleasant, often deeply pleasant, but its highest dignity lies elsewhere. It lies in the fact that another life has become a good one, is prepared to honor, even when that good does not flatter one's immediate appetite. That is one reason virtue friendship can feel severe from the outside. It asks for a kind of steadiness that cannot be reduced to emotional warmth. The friend is not there only to soften life. The friend is there as a partner in living well. This can include correction, disappointment, and sacrifice without ceasing to be friendship. Indeed, some of the strongest evidence that the friendship is centered on the good may appear when ease is interrupted and the bond remains intact. Aristotle's point is not that friendship should become stern. It is that delight and support, however precious, are no longer the final court of appeal. The relation stands or falls on whether the good of the other has truly become central. Once that standard is heard clearly, two consequences follow. First, the highest friendship cannot be casual. If character is central, then character must somehow be known. Second, the friendship cannot be instantaneous in the way delight sometimes seems instantaneous. One may feel immediate recognition, but the question is whether such recognition has yet earned knowledge. Aristotle therefore moves from the object of love to the slowness required to test it. The highest friendship changes the object before it changes the feeling, and because its object has character, time becomes unavoidable. Some bonds announce themselves with unusual force. The first long conversation feels strangely familiar. Trust seems to arrive before evidence. The mind says, perhaps too quickly, that something rare has appeared. Aristotle does not mock that experience. He only refuses to let intensity stand in for knowledge. If the highest friendship depends on stable character, then time is not a bureaucratic delay placed in front of feeling. Time is the medium in which character becomes visible. That is why Aristotle says the best friends must, as the proverb goes, eat salt together. The image is wonderfully plain, not revelation, not destiny, not a single decisive scene. Meals, repetition, shared life across enough occasions that each person becomes legible to the other. Salt here means the slow accumulation of ordinary company. It stands for the fact that no one can be known at the level virtue friendship requires in a flash of mutual enthusiasm. This can sound disappointing if we are attached to the romance of immediacy. We often want deep recognition to prove itself quickly. Delay can feel like distrust. If the bond feels powerful, why hesitate? Aristotle's answer is not emotional coldness, it is moral seriousness. The question is not whether one has felt strongly, but whether one has seen how the other acts over time, how they bear strain, how they order desire, how they speak, how they remain themselves across changing circumstances. Character is not a mood. It cannot be inferred from one shining encounter. That is also why time alone does not solve the problem. Many people have known one another for years without ever reaching virtue friendship. Duration can preserve habit, shared memory, or stale obligation as easily as it reveals goodness. Aristotle is not giving us a crude metric where old friendship automatically means high friendship. He is saying that the best friendship requires tested familiarity, and tested familiarity requires lived time. Years may be necessary, but they are not sufficient. There is relief in that distinction. It means we do not have to romanticize long history. A bond may be ancient and still remain organized by utility, pleasure, or a mixed and unstable combination of the two. Oldness can deepen a friendship, but it can also merely sediment it. What matters is not the number of years by itself, but what has been revealed through them. Has character shown itself? Has mutual goodwill proved itself? Has the relation learned to survive changes in circumstance without collapsing into resentment or indifference? Aristotle's rarity claim belongs here as well. Best friendship is rare because good people are rare in the strong sense he requires, and because even when such people exist, coming to know one another at that depth takes time. Rarity is not snobbery. It is not an insult to ordinary companionship. It is simply the consequence of a demanding standard. The highest friendship joins moral quality with tested familiarity, and neither condition appears cheaply. This lets us hear certain disappointments more honestly. Sometimes a bond felt immediate, promising, almost fated in its first season. Then later, under ordinary pressure, its limits became visible. One person could not sustain truthfulness. Another could not remain generous when delight waned. Another was constant only while convenience supported the constancy. Aristotle would not say the early closeness meant nothing. He would say the friendship had not yet earned the name of the highest kind, simply because feeling arrived before proof. The emphasis on time also guards against a common confusion about rarity. When Aristotle says the best friendship is rare, he is not saying that only a few privileged people deserve closeness. He is saying that stable goodness, recognized and trusted between two persons, is a slow achievement. Rare things are not always glamorous. Sometimes they are rare because they require patience through the ordinary. Meals, conversations, disappointments survived without falsity, differences handled without spite, loyalty shown when no pleasure is being bought by it. Aristotle's standard is built out of such plain materials. That is part of why it is demanding. We prefer dramatic proof. He trusts repetition more. There is a further lesson here about pace within the soul itself. Human beings are often quicker to project than to know. We fill silence with meaning, early trust with certainty, shared intensity with permanence. Aristotle's insistence on time is a discipline against projection. It asks us to let a friendship become visible through action before crowning it with a name it may or may not yet bear. This is not hostility to hope. It is respect for what friendship claims to be when it reaches its highest form. If the relation is going to rest on character, then it must endure the slow revelation of character. Otherwise we remain faithful, not to the friend, but to our first interpretation of them. In that sense, time is not a barrier placed in front of friendship. It is one of friendship's conditions of truth. Without time, we may have attraction, admiration, gratitude, and even unusual tenderness, but we do not yet know whether the bond can survive the ordinary tests that reveal its basis. Aristotle wants friendship to be more than a beautiful guess. That is why the metaphor of eating salt together matters so much. Salt belongs to repeated meals, shared days, accumulated weather. The highest friendship is proven there, in the slow exposure of each life to the other, not in the brightness of one beginning, and because of that, time humbles both hope and disappointment. It tells hope not to rush ahead of knowledge, and it tells disappointment not to mistake one failed season for the whole truth of a person too quickly. Friendship ripens or withers through recurrence. Aristotle trusts that slow recurrence more than he trusts any single mood. The bond becomes visible through what each person repeatedly chooses when the novelty is gone. That is why time does not weaken the highest friendship. It gives it the only kind of evidence worthy of its name. The slowness Aristotle asks for is therefore a form of respect. It respects the friend enough to let them become known as they are, and it respects friendship enough not to crown it before its basis has shown itself. Quick certainty is easier. Truth is slower. That slowness can feel almost old-fashioned in a world that likes immediate emotional verdicts. Aristotle does not apologize for it. He thinks friendship deserves better than speed. It deserves patience as well as affection. We should also notice what Aristotle does not teach here. He does not command suspicion. He does not tell us to keep others at arm's length until a checklist is completed. He is describing what friendship at its fullest needs, if it is to be stable and truthful. The slowness is descriptive before it is prescriptive. A person may gladly welcome another into their life quickly. The question is only what has and has not yet been shown. Time, therefore, has a double function. It reveals character, and it reveals the basis of the bond itself. A friendship that seemed grounded in admiration may prove grounded in delight. One that seemed grounded in concern for the other's good may prove unable to survive in convenience. One that began in utility may deepen into something nobler once the original need disappears and affection persists. Time does not create these truths from nothing, it uncovers them. So the proverb about salt is not quaint, it is exact. The highest friendship is slow because human beings are slow to become known, and once we admit that, Another structural condition comes into view. Even if character is gradually revealed, friendship cannot live fully in one person's private regard. It must be returned and recognized. It is possible to care for someone deeply without friendship yet existing in Aristotle's full sense. That can sound harsh until we notice the distinction he is making. Goodwill is not the same as friendship. You may admire someone, wish them well, even act for their good, while the relation remains one-sided or unknown. Aristotle insists that friendship requires reciprocal goodwill and not merely reciprocal in fact. Each person must know the return. The bond must be shared between them as friendship. This makes friendship less private than feeling often is. Private benevolence can be noble. Silent devotion can be moving. A person can love another at a distance in a way that is morally serious. Aristotle does not mock any of that. He only says it remains incomplete. Friendship is not something that can live entirely inside one's soul. It is a relation, and relation requires mutual return. If the other does not return the goodwill, or if the return is never known, then what exists may still be humanly important, but it is not yet friendship in the strict sense. That claim is emotionally clarifying because one-sided care often borrows the language of friendship to dignify itself. We say friend when what we mean is attachment, reverence, longing, loyalty, or a hope for relation that never became shared. Aristotle's distinction can sting, but it also releases us from confusion. Not every sincere concern reaches the form of friendship. Some forms of care remain admirable precisely because they are not consumed by resentment over lacking a title they never truly received. Mutual recognition matters because without it, even returned goodwill does not become a stable shared reality. Suppose two people each think warmly of the other, but neither knows the other's mind. Something important exists, yet friendship remains embryonic. A relation becomes what it is through disclosure, acknowledgement, and the practical living out of mutual regard. Aristotle's phrase about reciprocal goodwill, known to each other, captures this perfectly. The friendship must be public at least to the two persons who inhabit it. This is not bookkeeping. It is not a legal contract of equivalent sentiment. Aristotle is not reducing friendship to explicit negotiation. He is simply observing that friendship, unlike secret admiration, belongs to a shared world between persons. If one heart holds the bond while the other does not, or does not know it, the form remains incomplete. A friendship cannot live only in one heart. That incompleteness matters because it marks the difference between noble feeling and actual relation. One can honor the first without pretending it is the second. Aristotle's insistence here is bracing, but it also keeps friendship from becoming fantasy. The bond must have two conscious participants. Otherwise, even deep goodwill remains something other than the shared reality his account is trying to describe. That thought also deepens the role of speech in action. Mutual recognition is not merely a hidden psychological state. It is something made visible in patterns of response, trust, attention, and presence. Each person comes to know not only that goodwill exists, but that it is being lived as friendship. Without this, the bond stays uncertain, vulnerable to fantasy or asymmetry. One person may think the relation deep while the other treats it as occasional delight. One may assume enduring obligation while the other assumes a pleasant season. Mutual knowledge is what begins to rescue the friendship from that blur. Still, reciprocity by itself does not finish Aristotle's account. Two people can both care, both know the care is returned, and yet the relation can remain lopsided in a way that generates strain. One may give more labor, another more admiration, another more benefit, another more dependence. Complaint enters precisely here. But before complaint, a more basic question appears. If friendship requires return, what kind of balance must govern that return when two people are not identical in need, status, age, or capacity? It is worth pausing over how different this is from the fantasy of solitary purity. We sometimes imagine that one-sided love is morally higher because it asks for nothing back. Aristotle will not praise it in that way. He would say one-sided care may be admirable, but friendship is a shared practice, not a private sacrifice. That matters because it preserves the relational dignity of friendship. The friend is not a screen on which I project noble feelings. The friend is another person whose own mind, choice, and recognition complete the bond. Reciprocity is therefore not a concession to selfishness. It is the condition that keeps friendship from collapsing into inward monologue. This also explains why mutual recognition can feel almost as important as mutual affection. There is a peculiar loneliness in caring for someone without knowing whether the care is inhabited from the other side. Even if goodwill exists in both directions, uncertainty keeps the relation thin and tentative. Aristotle's insistence that each know the other's return makes friendship less mystical and more human. It lives in gestures, speech, memory, response, and a shared confidence that the bond is real for both. Without that confidence, persons may circle one another with warmth and still never cross into the frankness friendship requires. In that sense, recognition is not extra ceremony added to goodwill. It is part of what turns goodwill into a lived relation. Reciprocity also prevents one of the quiet corruptions of friendship, the temptation to define the bond alone. If I take my own concern as sufficient proof, I turn the other person into an object inside my story. Aristotle resists that. Friendship exists between two lives, not inside one private interpretation. The other's return does not flatter my feeling, it completes the relation. That is why reciprocity is not an unpleasant demand for equal reward. It is the refusal to let love become a solitary fiction. It also means that friendship has a kind of public honesty, even when it remains private to the two persons involved. Each must be able to stand within the relation knowingly. Neither can carry the whole meaning alone. This keeps the friendship from becoming hidden worship on one side and accidental comfort on the other. Aristotle's requirement is demanding because it makes friendship answerable to the actual awareness of both people, not merely to the depth of feeling in one of them. Mutual recognition therefore gives friendship a special kind of peace. The relation no longer depends on guessing whether the other sees what you see. A shared world has begun. That is why Aristotle treats recognition as structural rather than ornamental. It is part of what allows a friendship to become an actual bond, instead of a beautiful possibility. Without that peace, even strong affection remains strangely precarious. One keeps reading signs, wondering about meaning, and filling silence with interpretation. Aristotle's point is that friendship should not have to live forever under that uncertainty. It becomes real through mutual knowledge. This is where many modern intuitions start reaching for arithmetic. We assume equality means sameness, the same energy, the same language of care, the same amount of attention, the same type of return. Aristotle thinks that picture is too simple. Reciprocity must be present, yes, but its shape may vary according to the relation. The idea of equality has to be refined before friendship can be understood in hard cases. So reciprocity closes one door and opens another. It closes the door on the fantasy that private devotion is enough. It opens the door on a new difficulty. If friendship must be shared, how can it remain just when the two people are unequal? Aristotle's answer is not sameness, it is proportion. Few things sour a bond faster than the feeling that the relation has become uneven. One person gives, the other receives. One carries the conversation, the planning, the practical care, the patience, the deference, the admiration. The other returns less, or returns something different, or returns it in a form the first person barely recognizes as return at all. The ordinary mind reaches quickly for a simple standard. Equality means the same from both sides. Aristotle thinks friendship is harder than that. He agrees that friendship seeks equality, but equality for him does not always mean identical exchange. In many unequal relations, the same thing cannot be returned in the same measure. What is required is fitting proportion, that can sound abstract until we bring it back to the human strain that prompted it. Suppose the goods moving through a friendship are different in kind. One offers guidance, another gratitude, one offers care, another honor, one offers practical help, another reverence. Identical return may be impossible, and yet some form of justice may still be required. This is one reason Aristotle feels remote and useful at the same time. Remote because his examples often come from a social world we no longer share without reservation. Useful because the structural problem remains recognizably human. We all know bonds in which one side cannot simply duplicate the other's contribution. A parent and child do not give back the same things. A benefactor and beneficiary do not mirror one another. A student and teacher do not. Aristotle asks how such relations can be stabilized without pretending away the inequality or declaring friendship impossible. Proportion is his answer. The return should be fitting to the relation and to the persons involved. That does not mean anything goes. It does not mean the stronger side may demand endless deference while calling it friendship, nor does it mean hidden domination becomes noble once dressed in philosophical language. Aristotle is trying to avoid a different mistake, the assumption that all equality must look like sameness. Some bonds require balance through different but corresponding returns. This is harder to hear today because modern moral imagination is alert, often rightly, to the ways hierarchy disguises itself. Aristotle's world can sound too comfortable with inequality. We should keep that discomfort alive. But we should also notice that his conceptual point is not reducible to hierarchy. Whenever two people differ significantly in role or power, simple mirroring cannot settle justice in the bond. Something like proportion becomes unavoidable. The question is whether the unequal relation can still support reciprocal goodwill without collapsing into mere use. That means proportion is not a soft version of boundaries talk, nor is it a spreadsheet of favors. Aristotle is not advising us to track every gift and response. He is asking a structural question about what counts as due between friends differently placed. The relation survives when each side gives what is fitting to it, not when each side performs an identical script. Equality becomes moral adjustment rather than arithmetic duplication. Seen this way, certain disappointments look different. Sometimes the complaint in a friendship is not that one person gave nothing, but that the return was of the wrong kind. Honor was answered with convenience. Care was answered with charm. Guidance was answered with entitlement. Delight was answered with dependence. Aristotle's account helps explain why such mismatches feel unjust even when some response was offered. Friendship is not saved by the bare fact of exchange. The exchange must fit the relation. At the same time, proportion must not be allowed to sanctify every unequal arrangement. This is where our distance from Aristotle remains morally important. Not every asymmetrical bond is made just because each side gives what is fitting. Some ancient examples rely on assumptions about rank, gender, or authority that we cannot simply inherit. The value of Aristotle's account lies in the structure he reveals, not in an obligation to endorse every social form in which he placed it. Yet even with that caution, proportion illuminates many tensions that sameness leaves unexplained. Imagine two people who genuinely care for one another, but one has much greater practical capacity, age, or authority. If equality meant identical return, the weaker side would fail from the beginning. If equality meant nothing at all, the stronger side could absorb the relation into patronage. Proportion tries to avoid both failures. It says that friendship can remain just when each side returns what answers the bond in a fitting way. This is morally more flexible than sameness, but it is also more searching because it demands judgment. What truly fits this relation? What return honors the difference without freezing it into permanent inferiority? Aristotle does not make those questions comfortable. He only shows why they cannot be avoided. The language of proportion also rescues friendship from a hidden rigidity in modern fairness talk. We often know a bond is lopsided, but we misdescribe the problem because we are looking for identical measures. One person says, "I do more." Another answers, "Yes, but I give in a different way." Aristotle helps us ask whether the different way really answers the good being given. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. That is why his theory can clarify resentment without turning resentment into a moral compass. The complaint must still be judged, but at least we now understand that justice in friendship is not a matter of counting only one kind of coin. This becomes even clearer when the goods exchanged are not the same sort of thing. Practical help may be answered by steady gratitude. Wise counsel may be answered by trust and honor. Material support may be answered by a form of loyalty that cannot be priced. Aristotle does not say these answers are always enough. He says the friendship cannot even be judged well unless we see that the same outward measure will not fit every relation. Sameness would actually falsify many bonds. Proportion asks for the harder achievement of fittingness. That is why equality in friendship is never merely numeric, it is moral. That moral character of equality explains why the same outward balance can conceal very different realities. Two people may appear evenly matched in effort while one secretly gives the only good that matters to the relation. Another pair may look uneven and yet be fittingly aligned because what each gives truly answers the other's place. Aristotle's notion of proportion forces us to look beneath appearances toward the good exchanged. Friendship is just, in his sense, when the exchange honors the relation's real structure rather than an abstract rule of sameness. This is one of the reasons Aristotle remains useful when modern fairness talk becomes thin. He reminds us that justice in friendship is not a matter of keeping score alone. The deeper question is whether the return really meets the relation. Only then can equality be more than a surface impression. Seen this way, proportion asks more of us than complaint does. Complaint can say only that the relation feels off. Proportion asks what a fitting return would actually look like here. That is a harder question, and a more honest one. So the correction is double. Equality is not mere sameness, but proportion is not permission for domination. Friendship asks for balance, and sometimes balance can only take the form of unlike returns. That makes the theory more realistic. It also makes it more dangerous if used lazily, which is why Aristotle now presses directly into unequal friendships themselves. Balance is real even when symmetry is impossible. But whether an unequal bond truly becomes friendship depends on how that balance is lived. Some of the relations that most shape a life begin in obvious inequality. Parent and child, teacher and student, benefactor and beneficiary, elder and younger. In Aristotle's own discussion, even husband and wife, or ruler and ruled, appear under this pressure, carrying assumptions we no longer accept without resistance. If friendship required strict sameness, many of these relations would fall outside its reach entirely. Aristotle does not want that result. He thinks some unequal bonds can count as friendships, but only if the return is proportionate to the difference. His argument becomes most interesting where it is least comfortable. The easier path would be to speak only of equal companions and leave the hard cases aside. Aristotle does the opposite. He uses the hard cases to test the theory. If friendship can survive inequality at all, then it cannot be because the two sides simply duplicate one another's part. The parent gives one sort of good, the child another. The benefactor gives a benefit that cannot be repaid in kind, so the answer may take the form of honor or gratitude. The superior gives differently from the inferior. Whether that remains friendship depends on whether reciprocal goodwill can be maintained through fitting difference. This is where proportion becomes concrete. Suppose someone has given a good that cannot literally be returned in the same kind. Equal repayment would be impossible. Does that mean the relation must remain one of debt rather than friendship? Aristotle says not necessarily. The return may be adjusted to what the receiver can fittingly offer. Gratitude, honor, acknowledgement, loyalty, care of another sort. These are not decorative emotions. They are the forms through which proportion tries to hold the relation together. But he is not naive about the danger. Unequal bonds are under more pressure because the temptation to category confusion is stronger. The one who gives more may expect one kind of return while the other assumes another. The stronger party may call for affection when what they really want is obedience. The weaker party may enjoy the benefits while withholding recognition of the relation's shape. Proportion does not remove these risks. It names the narrow path by which friendship might still exist under difference. To read Aristotle well here, we have to refuse two opposite simplifications. One says, any inequality destroys friendship in advance. The other says, all hierarchy can be made friendly if each side does its part. Aristotle teaches neither. He says, some unequal bonds can become friendships because human beings often stand in different relations while still sharing goodwill. But he also shows, often indirectly, how unstable those friendships are when expectations about fitting return diverge. This is why his examples should be heard as argumentative structures rather than ready-made moral endorsements. When he speaks of parental love, benefaction, or superior and inferior, he is analyzing how friendship might survive where sameness fails. We can learn from that structure without adopting the whole ancient social world in which he embeds it. Modern discomfort is not a distraction from the argument. It is part of hearing the argument honestly. There is also a subtler insight here. Some bonds hold precisely by difference, rather than by mirroring. A child does not answer a parent's care by becoming a parent in return. A student does not answer a teacher's instruction by teaching the teacher the same lesson back. Even among adults, one person may be stronger in counsel, another in generosity, another in truthfulness, another in practical fidelity. If the friendship is to endure, each must return what suits the relation rather than imitate the other's contribution mechanically. Yet Aristotle's account keeps us from romanticizing difference. Different returns are not enough if the underlying goodwill is absent or misrecognized. A relation may contain gratitude without friendship, dependence without friendship, admiration without friendship. The question never disappears. Is there reciprocal goodwill, known to both, organized around a fitting balance and, in the highest case, around the good? When that question is forgotten, proportion becomes a mask. This is one place where Aristotle's severity is actually useful. He refuses to let every meaningful, unequal bond be called friendship automatically. That may sound ungenerous, but it protects the concept from sentimentality. A child may rightly honor a parent and still not stand in friendship with that parent, in the same way two equals do. A student may owe gratitude to a teacher without the relation becoming full friendship. A beneficiary may depend on a benefactor and yet remain outside friendship if goodwill is not shared in the right way. Aristotle is not diminishing these relations. He is distinguishing them so their goods and their risks become clearer. Some bonds shape a life profoundly without therefore reaching the same form. That clarification matters because unequal bonds often tempt us either to idealize or to dismiss. We idealize them when they are tender, calling them friendship simply because they matter. We dismiss them when they are difficult, denying that friendship could survive any structural difference. Aristotle does neither. He lets importance and inequality coexist while still asking whether the relation has achieved reciprocity, fitting return, and mutual recognition. That is the hard honesty of his account. Some unequal relations can become friendships, but only by doing more moral work than sentiment usually admits. The difference between affection, debt, gratitude, admiration, and friendship must stay visible, or the bond will eventually collapse under a name too generous for its structure. That refusal to blur the forms is one of the most respectful parts of Aristotle's theory. Gratitude can be noble without pretending to be equality. Reverence can be sincere without pretending to be mutual companionship. Dependence can be humanly important without pretending to be the same thing as friendship between peers. Once we hear that, we are less tempted either to flatter unequal bonds with the highest name, or to condemn them for not resembling a different kind of relation. Aristotle wants each bond judged by its own structure, not by our wish that every deep tie in life should sound the same. This is difficult because human affection often reaches beyond structure. We may feel deep tenderness toward those above or below us in age, power, or debt. Aristotle does not deny the tenderness. He asks whether the tenderness has achieved mutuality of the right sort. That question can be painful because the answer may be no or not yet. Yet the pain belongs to truth. Better to know what kind of bond is actually present than to decorate it with a name it cannot bear when pressure comes. So unequal friendship remains possible, but never by pretending difference away. The relation must find a way for goodwill to move back and forth honestly through the difference. Where that does not happen, importance remains, perhaps even love remains, but the full form of friendship does not. That may disappoint our desire to name every important bond in the same noble way. Aristotle accepts the disappointment. Better a difficult truth than a generous confusion that collapses when real strain arrives. This is also where complaint begins to make philosophical sense. Unequal friendships are especially vulnerable to resentment because each side may understand the due differently. One thinks honor was owed, another thinks affection was enough. One thinks care deserved gratitude, another thinks gratitude has already been paid. When complaint erupts, Aristotle hears not only bad temper but structural mismatch. The two persons may never have been inhabiting the same friendship. Some bonds hold by difference, not by mirroring. But difference makes misunderstanding easier, not harder. Which is why Aristotle turns next to complaint itself as a clue to the hidden terms of the bond. Resentment is often treated as if it settled its own meaning. If someone complains about a friendship, we are tempted to explain the whole matter by temperament. They were petty, they were needy, they kept score, they became ungrateful. Aristotle notices that some complaints are indeed ugly, but he also notices something more instructive. Complaint often reveals that the two people understood the friendship differently from the start. One thought the bond was governed by one set of terms, the other by another. This is especially clear in the unequal friendships he has just discussed, but it extends further. Whenever a bond combines usefulness, pleasure, and goodwill in shifting degrees, the relation can remain stable only if the persons involved are broadly inhabiting the same kind of friendship. If one treats the bond as enduring concern, while the other treats it as season-bound delight, resentment becomes likely. If one expects practical loyalty and the other expects only warmth, complaint becomes likely. The resentment is not merely emotional noise. It is evidence that the basis of the bond was mismatched. That thought is powerful because it reinterprets a common wound. Sometimes what hurts in a broken friendship is not only loss, it is the discovery that the same bond had been understood under two different names. One person thought there was a deeper mutual claim. The other thought there was affection without that claim. One thought long history guaranteed a living relation. The other thought history deserved gratitude, but not continued closeness. Complaint in such cases is not greed in pure form. It is the pain of a misnamed relation. Aristotle's analysis of complaint therefore extends the earlier taxonomy. Utility and pleasure friendships often break because the underlying benefit or delight changes. But they also break because each party may disagree about what the friendship was asking for all along. Did the help create a lasting bond, or only a bond for the duration of the help? Did the delight imply enduring devotion, or only companionship while the delight remained vivid? Unless those terms are shared, friendship carries a concealed instability. This should not lure us into scorekeeping. Aristotle is not recommending suspicion as the healthy posture. He is not teaching us to interrogate every friendship with explicit contractual precision. He is only showing why complaint is philosophically revealing. It discloses the hidden grammar of the relation. What did each person think was owed? What form of return did each imagine? What object of love had each silently placed at the center? Seen in that light, some complaints become less melodramatic and more tragic. A person may not be angry because they wanted too much. They may be angry because the bond they thought they inhabited never existed in the same way for the other. Their pain comes from discovering asymmetry at the level of understanding. The friendship was not one thing fractured by a later event. It may have been two differently imagined bonds occupying the same hours. This also explains why certain endings feel so confusing. The external facts can look minor. No explicit betrayal, no cruelty, no explosive insult. Yet the sense of loss is disproportionate because the fracture occurred at the level of meaning. Aristotle lets us hear that. He says the terms of the bond were not shared, and only under strain did that become visible. Complaint is the sound of concealed mismatch becoming audible. Once we hear complaint this way, resentment stops being only a moral flaw and starts becoming evidence that a relation had a hidden structure. That does not mean the resentful person is automatically right. People can indeed complain from vanity, entitlement, or wounded pride. Aristotle knows that. His point is narrower and more useful. Before we condemn the complaint, we should ask what picture of the friendship each person had been carrying. Did one imagine durable concern while the other imagined temporary collaboration? Did one hear gratitude as enough while the other heard gratitude as the beginning of a deeper claim? These differences do not excuse every grievance, but they explain why grievance can feel so disproportionate to the visible event that triggered it. The event is often small because it only uncovers an older disagreement about the bond's meaning. This is one reason Aristotle's treatment of complaint feels psychologically mature without becoming therapeutic. He does not ask us to heal resentment through a technique. He asks us to understand what resentment is saying about the friendship's terms. In that sense, complaint behaves like a cracked wall that finally reveals where the foundation was under strain. The friendship may have looked settled while need, habit, or pleasure kept it moving smoothly. Only when those supports shifted did the two persons discover they had never shared the same expectation. One thought the bond contained a standing obligation, the other thought it contained kindness without such weight. Complaint is the painful moment in which that hidden disagreement becomes visible enough that neither person can ignore it. It follows that complaint can be morally mixed and still philosophically illuminating. The speaker may be unfair in tone, selfish in emphasis, or blind to their own role, and yet the complaint may still reveal that the relation's basis was never jointly understood. Aristotle's point is not to vindicate every grievance. It is to listen for what the grievance exposes. Beneath the anger, there is often a claim about what the friendship was supposed to be. Once that hidden claim is heard, many painful endings stop seeming random. They become intelligible as collisions between different understandings of loyalty, gratitude, delight, obligation, or care. Complaint, then, is not only about what someone wanted, it is about what they believed was already there. That is why resentment can feel so bewildering to the other person. They may not simply be refusing a demand. They may be discovering, too late, that the relation had been interpreted through a very different lens. Aristotle's analysis makes that bewilderment speakable. The bond fractures because the same history was carrying two incompatible meanings, and that is why complaint belongs so naturally after the discussion of utility, pleasure, and unequal return. Those earlier distinctions are the hidden grammar of resentment. When the grammar remains unspoken, the pain arrives as accusation. Once the grammar is heard, the accusation can be translated into a more exact philosophical question. What sort of friendship did each person think this was? Aristotle does not remove the hurt. He gives it better language. That better language is itself a form of mercy. It does not erase the wound. It prevents the wound from turning every disappointment into proof of betrayal. Sometimes the bond broke because its terms were never shared in the same way. There is a wider lesson here too. The basis of friendship cannot remain merely remembered or privately assumed. It has to be enacted in a shared life. If the relation is left to drift on accumulated feeling and inherited title, its hidden terms may never be tested until the moment of breakage. Aristotle, therefore, moves from complaint toward a richer account of what friends actually do together. Friendship is not only a label for past closeness, it is a form of living. That shift matters because chronology by itself proves less than we think. A bond can be old and still inactive. It can be treasured and still no longer lived. If complaint exposes misaligned expectations, the next question is what would make a friendship actively shared rather than merely historically remembered. Sometimes the wound is not greed, it is misnamed relation, and once we hear that, Aristotle's next claim becomes unavoidable. Friendship lives through shared activity, speech, and thought, not history alone. There are friendships that remain honored almost entirely by memory. The title survives. The gratitude survives. The tenderness may survive. Yet the life of the friendship itself has become uncertain. Aristotle forces us to ask a difficult question. What do friends actually do in common? In Book 9, his answer is much richer than mere proximity. Friends live together, but living together does not simply mean occupying the same house or even the same city. It means sharing activity, speech, judgment, and the specifically human forms of life through which each becomes present to the other. This is why chronology cannot prove enough. Years in one another's orbit may create familiarity, obligation, nostalgia, and inherited affection. But if friendship is active, then the mere fact that something once was does not show that it still is in the same sense. Aristotle does not command harsh revisionism about the past. He only asks whether the bond remains lived. Is there still shared action, shared understanding, shared delight in the other's actual life? Or has the friendship become a revered memory with little present participation? That question can sound severe only because we often imagine friendship as a possession. Once acquired, it remains in place until formally destroyed. Aristotle treats it more like an activity, not fragile in the sense of needing constant performance, but alive in the sense that it belongs to what two people continue doing and perceiving together. Friendship is not only what happened, it is what can still be lived. This does not mean frequency metrics or extrovert standards. Aristotle is not measuring friendship by the number of messages sent or hours spent in the same room. His point is subtler and more human. Friends share a world in action. They participate in one another's judgments, speech, choices, and awareness. Their companionship is specifically human because it is not merely co-presence like cattle grazing beside one another. It involves living together at the level of thought and activity. That distinction reveals why some long bonds feel hollow without being hostile. The people involved may still be kindly disposed. They may still say the old name with sincerity. Yet nothing central is any longer shared. The present life of each no longer enters the others in the way friendship requires. Aristotle helps us name that without disrespect. History remains meaningful. The friendship may still deserve honor. But history alone cannot carry the full burden of present reality. It also shows why conversation matters so much in his account. Speech is not decoration laid over friendship. It is one of the places where shared life occurs. Through speech, friends expose judgment, disclose what seems good to them, test perception, and inhabit a world in common. This is why the friendship of the good becomes inseparable from shared discernment. If the two do not participate in one another's seeing and choosing, the bond lacks a vital human dimension. There is a quiet challenge here for bonds preserved mainly by old feeling. Aristotle is not asking whether the past mattered. He is asking whether there is still a common life available to the friendship. Can the bond still be enacted through some shared activity of mind, speech, or life? If not, what remains may be gratitude, respect, perhaps even a gentle form of care, but not the same fullness that the highest friendship requires. Many friendships survive in language long after they have gone dormant in life. We keep using the old word out of tenderness, habit, or reluctance to admit change. Aristotle does not tell us to strip the word away harshly. He only asks us to hear what the word is supposed to name. A friendship is alive when two persons are still participating in one another's good through shared presence, thought, judgment, and activity. That can take many forms. It might be conversation that still sharpens both lives. It might be practical cooperation that now rests on deeper concern. It might be a quiet but real readiness to enter the other's world as it presently is. What it cannot be, in the highest sense, is only a museum of old scenes. That insight also rescues friendship from sentimentality about time. We often treat time as if it were doing the moral work by itself. Years passed. Memories accumulated. Therefore the relation must remain secure. Aristotle's account reminds us that time merely stores possibilities unless persons keep inhabiting one another's lives in some active way. A shared past can make present friendship easier, but it cannot substitute for present friendship. This is why some old companions become more truly friends as they age, while others remain bound only by narrative. The difference lies not in the length of history, but in whether the relation still contains an active exchange of life. Friendship, in other words, is not only remembered togetherness, it is present participation. That claim becomes especially vivid when we compare adjacency with companionship. Two people may speak often and still never really share a world. Another pair may meet rarely and yet remain deeply joined in judgment, concern, and active regard. Aristotle pushes us past superficial metrics toward a more demanding question. Does the life of each still enter the life of the other as something worth participating in? If it does, the friendship may be alive even under difficulty. If it does not, history alone cannot supply the missing present. The archive of old feeling cannot replace the activity by which friendship stays real. Shared life, therefore, has a practical and contemplative dimension at once. Friends do things together, but they also see together. They do not merely occupy hours, they expose one another to what each takes to be good, serious, foolish, beautiful, or worth pursuing. That is why a friendship can become hollow even when politeness remains. The shared seeing has stopped. Aristotle's account pushes us to notice that friendship dies first as an activity of mind and life, before it dies as a title. Once that shared seeing stops, memory alone begins carrying too much weight. Aristotle's warning is gentle but firm. History can honor a friendship, but it cannot continue it by itself. A living bond still needs present participation, even if only in sparse but real forms. Shared life is therefore one of the clearest proofs that friendship is happening in the present and not only surviving as an old name. It keeps friendship from becoming a relic of itself. That is why Aristotle's account can sound stricter than nostalgia once. Nostalgia is satisfied if the feeling once existed. Aristotle asks whether the relation still has life in it now. That question may hurt, but it also rescues friendship from being confused with mere sentiment about what used to be. Shared life keeps the bond honest by bringing it back to participation rather than memory alone. At the same time, Aristotle does not condemn distance or solitude. Shared life is not a doctrine of constant social presence. Two people may remain genuine friends across long intervals if there is still a living participation in one another's good and activity. The point is not physical nearness by itself. The point is that friendship belongs to an active relation, not merely to an archive of memory. This gathers much of the earlier argument. Utility friendships often end when the shared work ends. Pleasure friendships often thin when the shared delight changes. Virtue friendship aims at something more durable because the persons continue finding common life in what is good. The friendship can remain active through speech, judgment, and mutual willing of the good even as circumstances change. That is part of why its basis matters so much. History is not nothing. It can deepen trust, tenderness, and recognition. But Aristotle will not let us confuse oldness with fullness. Friendship lives where life is shared, and shared life, if it is to endure under changing conditions, needs a stable ground in the persons themselves, which is why Aristotle turns again to character. By now the structure is visible. Utility friendships are limited by changing benefit. Pleasure friendships are limited by changing delight. Shared life matters, reciprocity matters, proportion matters, but all of these still depend on what sort of persons are bearing them. Aristotle therefore returns to the basis that makes the highest friendship most durable, character. Goodness, in his sense, is more stable than usefulness or pleasure. That does not make good people unchangeable in every way. It means the governing orientation of their lives is less accidental. This is easy to flatten into reputation, but Aristotle means something deeper than image. Character is not what people say about you. It is the pattern by which desire, choice, and action are ordered. A person of good character is not one who performs virtue for praise. It is one whose life is genuinely shaped by what is noble and worth choosing. When two such people become friends, the bond is less dependent on transient satisfactions because the object of love is connected to something more lasting in each. That explains why the highest friendship is stable without becoming invulnerable. Aristotle is not promising a bond immune to death, distance, corruption, or tragedy. He is saying that if the friendship is grounded in stable goodness, it will not dissolve merely because pleasure fluctuates or advantage disappears. The friend remains lovable through the sort of person they are, not only through what they presently provide. This also clarifies why affection alone cannot guarantee durability. Affection may be intense and still unstable if its source is delight or need. Good feeling tells us something important, but not everything. The future of the bond depends partly on whether the persons involved remain ordered toward the good in a way that sustains trust, truthfulness, generosity, and shared judgment. Aristotle is not cold toward emotion. He is trying to show why emotion by itself cannot do the whole work. There is something attractive in this, but Aristotle never lets it become easy comfort. A friendship grounded in character is still demanding because character itself is demanding. One cannot simply declare the bond stable. The stability is earned through the repeatable shape of each life. How does the person act when pleasure withdraws? How do they answer inconvenience? How do they carry power? How do they remain truthful when truth costs something? These are questions of character, and friendship is exposed to their answers. This is why virtue friendship should not be heard as self-improvement branding. Aristotle is not inviting us to become idealized versions of ourselves in order to secure premium relationships. That entire tone misses him. He is describing a moral fact about why some friendships last and others do not. If the basis is unstable, the friendship remains unstable. If the basis is stable, the friendship gains a corresponding endurance. That fact can be aspirational without turning into coaching. We can also now see why the earlier hierarchy is structural rather than snobbish. Aristotle is not saying that practical or delightful friendships are morally inferior because ordinary people are beneath him. He is saying those friendships are less enduring because their object of love changes more easily. Character matters because it gathers many goods into a more stable center. It makes mutual goodwill less dependent on external shifts. Still, even this must be stated carefully. Character does not mean spotless behavior or a life without contradiction. Aristotle's standard is high, but not magical. Good people can still fail, still suffer, still lose clarity, still disappoint. The best friendship is more durable, not guaranteed. That matters because otherwise the argument slips into fantasy. No friendship, however noble, escapes finitude. Character becomes clearer if we think of it as the answer to a simple question: what usually governs this person when no one is watching for applause? Aristotle is interested in what has become settled enough in a life to outlast mood. Someone may be charming, intelligent, and moving in conversation while still being ruled when pressure rises by vanity or appetite. Another person may be less dazzling and yet more trustworthy because their choices keep returning to truth, fairness, and steadiness. Friendship of the highest sort depends on this deeper reliability. It does not require a polished moral image. It requires that the good has become a real organizing force in the person's life. Only then can the friendship rest on something less fragile than enjoyment or need. This also explains why character and friendship educate each other without collapsing into self-help rhetoric. We become more able to sustain good friendship as our character steadies, and good friendship can in turn confirm and strengthen a life ordered toward the noble. Yet Aristotle would still insist on the direction of dependence. The friendship does not create goodness from nothing. It reveals whether each life has enough order to carry the bond when easier supports disappear. That is why this question belongs after shared life rather than before it. Shared life shows what friendship does together. Character shows whether the persons involved can keep doing it truthfully over time. Without that basis, the friendship may still be lovely, but it remains vulnerable at its core. We could say that character is what gives friendship its unseen architecture. Pleasure may decorate the rooms, utility may keep the doors opening and closing, shared life may fill the house with movement, but if the supporting structure is weak, the whole bond remains exposed. Aristotle's claim is that goodness in the persons provides that structure, not perfection, not saintliness, a steadiness of truth, justice, generosity, and right desire strong enough that the friendship is not at the mercy of every shifting appetite. That is why stable character matters so much. It is the hidden reason some friendships can bear weight. Seen this way, character explains why the highest friendship can remain gentle without becoming soft. The bond does not need to be dramatic to be deep. It only needs persons in whom the good has become habitual enough that truth, fairness, and generosity do not vanish the moment they become inconvenient. Aristotle is interested in that habit of soul because friendship, like a building under weather, eventually rests on what has become structural. Without that structure, even warm bonds sag under ordinary strain. That image of structure also clarifies why Aristotle's hierarchy is not contemptuous toward lower friendships. A building may still shelter people, even if it was never meant to carry the heaviest load. Utility and pleasure are real supports in human life. They become unstable only when asked to bear what belongs to character. The best friendship differs because the persons themselves have become stronger ground. That is the quiet grandeur of Aristotle's claim. Character does this work quietly. It appears in repeated truthfulness, repeated fairness, and repeated steadiness under ordinary pressure. Friendship trusts those repetitions more than emotional display. That trust is what gives the bond real endurance. It also explains why character can be felt before it is named. We recognize it in the friend who does not become smaller under convenience, fear, or praise. What the highest friendship offers, then, is not certainty against loss, but a different kind of basis. The persons involved can remain friends through fluctuations that would destroy a friendship of use or pleasure, because what they love in one another is not identical with those fluctuations. Some friendships last because something in the persons lasts. And that leads Aristotle into one of his strangest and most revealing questions. If friendship of the good depends on the relation between character and the good, how does it connect to the self itself? Why does he call a friend another self? And what kind of self-love could make that possible without turning friendship back into selfishness? The relation between self-love and friendship seems at first glance impossible. If friendship is genuine concern for another, then surely self-love is the rival. And if self-love enters too strongly, friendship becomes disguised self-interest. Aristotle thinks this opposition is too simple because self-love itself is said in more than one way. There is a vulgar self-love that grabs pleasure, money, honor, and advantage for oneself. But there is also a better self-love in which a person chooses what is noble and genuinely good. Without this second kind, friendship cannot be understood. That claim is surprising because it refuses the fantasy of pure self-erasure. Aristotle does not ask the self to disappear from friendship. He asks it to be rightly ordered. A disordered self cannot sustain virtue friendship because it keeps bending the relation back toward appetite, vanity, or gain. The person who always seeks the larger share of pleasure or status will find friendship dragged downward toward use and advantage. Proper self-love, by contrast, chooses the noble and therefore becomes capable of willing the good for another without treating the other merely as an instrument. This is where Aristotle's famous phrase enters, "The friend is another self." Read lazily, that sounds like fusion, dependency, or mystical merger. Aristotle means none of those things. He is not saying the friend disappears into the self or that individuality is dissolved. He means that the relation to the friend mirrors, in an ethically thick way, the relation a good person has to their own life. One wants the good for the friend as for oneself. One rejoices and grieves in a shared moral horizon. The friend's flourishing is not alien to one's own concern, yet remains truly theirs. This makes friendship more intimate and more demanding. More intimate because the good person can genuinely identify with the friend's good. More demanding because the relation depends on a self already ordered well enough not to turn every concern back into private appetite. Friendship is not secured by having no self. It is secured by a self capable of right proportion in love. That is also why Aristotle's account avoids both sentimental altruism and vulgar egoism. If we say friendship requires complete selflessness, we make the relation psychologically and morally unintelligible. If we say friendship is always disguised self-interest, we make genuine concern impossible. Aristotle finds a middle course. The self remains present, But a good self is capable of loving another's good in a way not reducible to mere use. Another self does not mean second possession. It means a second center of concern recognized within a shared orientation toward the good. This helps explain why some friendships collapse back into lower forms, even when affection remains. If one person's inner life is disordered by vanity, hunger for honor, or ungoverned pleasure, the bond will tend to revolve around those things. The other becomes valuable as confirmer, comforter, admirer, or helper. The relation may still be warm, but it bends away from the other's good for their own sake. Aristotle's distinction about self-love shows where that bending begins. We should keep one limit in view. Aristotle does not eliminate all tension between self and other. Even the noblest friendship does not erase conflict of goods, competition of time, vulnerability to jealousy, or the pain of misrecognition. The friend as another self is a clarifying phrase, not a magical solution. It names a moral possibility that concern for another can be deeply integrated with a rightly loved self without collapsing into selfishness. This matters because suspicion about motives can otherwise eat through friendship from the inside. If every act of care is interpreted as disguised self-interest, then genuine friendship becomes impossible by definition. Yet if every act of self-concern is treated as contamination, then friendship demands an inhuman kind of self-loss. Aristotle refuses both extremes. Proper self-love does not mean treating oneself as the only good. It means loving the kind of life that is actually worth loving, a life ordered toward what is noble rather than toward grabbing every advantage. From that order, another person's good can become part of one's concern without ceasing to be theirs. Friendship is saved here not by abolishing the self, but by reforming what the self takes itself to be for. The phrase "another self" therefore works best as a test of seriousness. Do I regard the friend's flourishing as something external to my moral world, or has it become internal to the shape of the good as I understand it? Aristotle is asking for the second, yet he never says that the friend's life is mine to control. Another self is not another possession. It is another center of action and value whose good matters from within a shared horizon. That is why the phrase can be intimate without becoming possessive. It names nearness without absorption. It also explains why disordered self-love ruins friendship so quickly. A self bent toward honor, advantage, or pleasure cannot help pulling the friend back into those economies. Only a self already disciplined by the good can love another without trying to annex them. Seen this way, another self is less a mystical slogan than a moral discipline. It tells us to ask whether the friend's good has become genuinely thinkable to us as good in itself, and not only as an extension of our comfort or pride. That is a demanding test because it exposes how often affection still wants to possess. Aristotle does not accuse every deep attachment of possession. He only refuses to confuse closeness with right order. A life governed by the good can welcome nearness without swallowing the other. That is the sort of self-friendship requires. The phrase also keeps friendship from being reduced to empathy alone. To feel with another is important, but Aristotle is after something more stable than emotional resonance. He wants a self ordered enough to rejoice in the friend's good, grieve their losses, and still leave the friend free as another center of value. Another self is therefore a phrase of relation, not fusion. It tells us how close friendship can come without ceasing to be just. In that sense, proper self-love protects friendship from two opposite degradations at once. It protects it from selfishness, because the friend is no longer a tool of appetite or prestige, and it protects it from engulfment, because the friend is not absorbed into a boundaryless sentiment. Aristotle wants a self strong enough to love truly, and ordered enough not to dominate. Friendship requires that balance, because only such a self can will another's good without turning that good into a possession. Another self, then, names a nearness disciplined by justice. The friend matters from within one's own concern, yet remains irreducibly other. Aristotle needs both truths at once. Without that discipline, closeness turns possessive very quickly. Aristotle is trying to save friendship from that possession without draining it of warmth. There is also a hidden consolation here. If proper self-love is required for the highest friendship, then friendship does not demand self-annihilation. The good person need not hate their own good in order to love another's. On the contrary, a life ordered toward what is noble is precisely what makes such love possible. This is a severe and humane correction at once. The self is not erased, it is disciplined into relation. And once Aristotle has shown that proper self-love and friendship belong together, he can pose a final large question. If a flourishing person is already ordered and complete in some important sense, why would such a person still need friends at all? A certain fantasy appears again and again in human thought. If only a person were inwardly whole enough, strong enough, wise enough, then friends would become optional. Friendship would remain pleasant, perhaps, but no longer necessary. The complete person would stand complete in themselves. Aristotle refuses this fantasy. In Book 9 he asks whether the happy person needs friends, and his answer is striking. Even the flourishing person would not choose to live alone. Friendship is not merely a remedy for deficiency. It belongs inside the good life itself. This is one of the deepest points in the whole account because it changes the status of friendship from supplement to constituent. If friends were only for help, then perhaps the self-sufficient person could dispense with them. If friends were only for comfort, then perhaps the person already at peace could do without them. But Aristotle thinks flourishing is active. It consists in living and acting well, perceiving well, sharing speech and thought, exercising virtue in a fully human way. Such activity is not most complete in isolation. That does not mean solitude has no value. Aristotle is not waging war on aloneness. He is saying that the good life is not a private possession sealed inside one consciousness. Human flourishing has a shared dimension because human beings are the kinds of creatures whose best activities involve companionship, mutual recognition, and common life. The happy person still needs friends not as emotional crutches, but as participants in the life that happiness actually is. This helps us hear the whole hierarchy of friendship in a larger frame. Utility friendships matter because life includes need. Pleasure friendships matter because joy belongs to companionship. But the highest friendship matters most because it belongs directly to flourishing. It is not there merely to patch a lack. It is part of the good itself. To live well is, in Aristotle's picture, to share life well with others who are themselves oriented toward the good. That is why the friend as another self now returns with full force. The flourishing person values the friend's good not out of deficit, but out of fullness enacted in relation. Shared speech, shared perception, shared activity, shared delight in what is noble, these do not distract from the good life. They partly constitute it. Friendship becomes one of the ways in which a life is enlarged beyond private possession without being dissolved into the crowd. This also reveals why Aristotle's highest standard should not become a weapon. If virtue friendship belongs to flourishing, then it is rare, demanding, and beautiful. But rarity does not entitle us to downgrade every ordinary bond around us with contempt. Utility and pleasure friendships remain genuine, necessary, and often precious. They support human life, color it with delight, carry us through changing needs, and sometimes prepare the way for better forms of relation. The point is not to sneer at them from the summit of an ideal. Aristotle's claim about the happy person needing friends is powerful partly because it reverses a common order of explanation. We usually think friends matter because life is hard. Aristotle says they matter even when life goes well. That does not deny their comfort in difficulty. It simply means comfort is not the deepest reason. Friends are needed because human excellence is enacted in company. We think better with and beside others. We perceive more fully in shared life. We exercise generosity, truthfulness, justice, and delight in forms that isolation cannot supply by itself. Even the person who lacks nothing external would still lack a distinctively human completion if no such shared life were present. Friendship belongs to abundance as much as to need. That further clarifies why the whole argument should not be heard as relationship management. Aristotle is not helping us optimize our circle. He is describing the place of friendship within a serious human life. Utility, pleasure, reciprocity, proportion, character, self-love, and shared life are not isolated modules. They gather into one claim. The human good is not finished privately. To flourish is not only to possess good things inwardly, but to live them in a world where another person's good can be recognized, loved, and shared. This is why the opening doubt grows larger by the end. Asking what makes friendship real becomes a way of asking what kind of life can count as fully human. Aristotle's answer is demanding because it ties friendship to the shape of the good itself. This is why the late movement feels larger than social life. Friendship has become a window onto Aristotle's picture of the human being. We are not complete as sealed possessors of private excellence. We become more fully ourselves in a life where the good can be shared, witnessed, spoken, and loved between persons. That is why even happiness needs friends. Not because happiness is secretly deficient, but because human flourishing is active in a way that reaches naturally beyond isolation. Friendship belongs to that reach. Once that is understood, the opening doubt has fully changed its scale. Asking what makes friendship real is no longer asking only which bonds are deepest. It is asking what sort of life allows another person's good to belong within one's own flourishing without being swallowed by it. Aristotle's answer is that such a life cannot be purely private. Friendship is one of the clearest places where the human good becomes shared rather than possessed. That is why friendship, for Aristotle, is never just one more good among others. It is one of the clearest ways the whole shape of the good life becomes visible. That is why the closing implication is larger than personal comfort. A person could have status, security, and private peace, and still lack the fullness Aristotle has in view if no real friendship belonged to the life. Human flourishing is not a sealed achievement. It asks to be enacted with and toward others. Friendship is one of the clearest proofs that the good life is participatory, not solitary. Even happiness, if it is truly human, has room for another. Instead, Aristotle changes the question we ask of friendship. We no longer ask only whether we feel close, whether the history is long, whether the help was real, whether the delight was vivid. We ask what is being loved, how the goodwill is returned, whether balance is fitting, whether the relation is actively lived, whether the character involved is stable, and whether the friendship belongs to flourishing itself rather than merely to occasional need or passing pleasure. In that way, the argument circles back to the beginning with greater precision. The late-hour doubt about friendship was never just about disappointment. It was about basis, what really held the bond together. By the end of Aristotle's account, that question has become richer than suspicion and calmer than self-protection. It is a question about the kind of life two people were sharing and the good they were actually loving in one another. It is also a question about how much of human life can be lived truthfully alone. Aristotle's answer, carried across the whole discussion, is less and less. We can think alone, remember alone, and perhaps even endure alone for long stretches. But flourishing in the fullest sense keeps reaching outward toward shared recognition, shared speech, shared action, and shared delight in what is good. Friendship is one of the clearest names for that reach. This is why the question matters so much more than social classification. It touches the very structure of a life. That makes the word real both harder and gentler. Harder because the fullest friendship asks much more than affection. Gentler because not every bond that falls short must be dismissed as fraudulent. Aristotle gives us a scale of seriousness without collapsing it into insult. He lets us keep gratitude for limited friendships while reserving a more demanding honor for the friendship of the good. At this point, the central question has become larger than social reassurance. We are not looking for a rule to sort people. We are looking at a picture of human life in which friendship reveals what we think a person is for, what goodness is for, and whether a life can be fully good alone. Aristotle's answer is that it cannot, not in the fullest human sense. The good life is not a private room with the door closed. Real friendship now sounds rarer, more beautiful, and more exact. It names a relation in which another person's good is not incidental, in which mutual recognition is real, in which shared life remains active, and in which the friendship belongs not merely to our needs but to our flourishing. That is enough to bring us to the end. We began with a quiet doubt. A bond can feel warm, loyal, dear, and still leave a question behind. Aristotle answers that doubt by refusing to let one word cover every kind of closeness. Some friendships are grounded in usefulness, some in pleasure. Both are real, both can matter deeply. Both can also end when the good that organized them disappears. The highest friendship asks for more. It asks that the other be loved as good, that the goodwill be returned and known, that time reveal character, that shared life remain active, and that the bond belong to flourishing itself, rather than only to need or delight. That is why Aristotle's standard feels beautiful and severe at once. It honors ordinary companionship without pretending every form of nearness is the same. He also refuses two easy mistakes. One is to call every fading bond fake. The other is to use the highest ideal as a weapon against ordinary life. Utility and pleasure friendships are genuine and often necessary. The highest friendship is rare because stable character, mutual recognition, and shared life are difficult achievements, not because ordinary human bonds are worthless. So what makes friendship real in the fullest Aristotelian sense? Not warmth alone, not long history alone, not usefulness alone, not delight alone. Real friendship at its height is a relation in which another person is loved as good. The love is mutually recognized, and life is shared in a way that belongs to flourishing. That answer does not give a rule for tomorrow. It gives a better question. When a bond matters, what stands at its center? What is being loved? What is being returned? What kind of life can still be lived there? Aristotle leaves us with that harder question because he thinks friendship matters too much for sentimental shortcuts. That is also why his account becomes calmer as it grows more exact. He is not asking us to become suspicious of every imperfect bond. He is asking us to hear difference without contempt. Some friendships help us through life. Some brighten it. Some become rare forms of shared moral life. The distinctions do not flatten our memories. They let each bond tell the truth about itself. Under the same light, we can hear why the highest friendship belongs inside flourishing rather than at its edge. A life that can only enjoy itself privately remains narrower than Aristotle's good life. Real friendship opens a space where another person's good is no longer incidental to one's own concern, where truth can be spoken, and where shared life remains active even when pleasure and usefulness shift. That may be enough for one night, enough to hear the word friend with more care, enough to remember old bonds without flattening them, enough to understand why Aristotle made the question harder precisely because he thought friendship mattered so much. Under that light, friendship becomes harder to name casually and easier to respect truthfully. Some roads separate, some remain shared, and some rare bonds do more than comfort us or help us. They let us see, with unusual clarity, that the good life was never meant to be a private possession. That is a real comfort. It does not simplify friendship. It simply lets friendship be serious without becoming cynical, and tender without becoming vague. It asks us to keep the warmth, but give the warmth better understanding. That is a small gift, though not a small one. Many hurts become more truthful under it, and many memories become more precise without becoming colder. For a philosopher of friendship, that is already a humane ending. It leaves the night clearer. That clarity is its own companionship, and that matters more than it first seems. It leaves us with fewer slogans, but with better questions, steadier gratitude, and a truer sense of why friendship can brighten a life without ever becoming a simple thing. That is part of its quiet mercy.